Strip down now, fat girl. The obese woman thought the mountain man was a monster, but then, die under a grizzly's claws, you fat, useless girl. That's the only end you deserve. Silas Hartley's drunken roar cracked through the frozen night as he shoved Violet off the saddle and into the snow. The Rocky Mountains loomed like black teeth around them, pine trees clawing at a sky full of icy stars. The wind was knife-sharp, slicing through Violet's thin dress and worn wool sweater as if they were nothing. She stumbled, fell to her knees, and heard the brittle crust of ice snap under her weight. Her breath puffed white, ragged, terrified. "Please," she begged, hands outstretched toward the only two people she had in this world. "Please don't leave me here. I'll do better, I swear. I'll work harder, eat less, anything you want. Just don't—" Her mother, Lydia, sat rigid in the saddle beside Silas, fingers clenched around her shawl. She wouldn't look at Violet, wouldn't look at her daughter's tear-streaked face, wouldn't look at the girl she'd allowed to be dragged out of the only home she'd ever known. "Get up," Silas snarled, leaning down in the saddle, whiskey sour on his breath. "You had your chance. A rich old man offered marriage, and you turned up that fat nose of yours. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed this family." "We could have talked to her," Lydia whispered, voice breaking. "She's only 20, Silas. She's still our problem," he snapped. "Not anymore." Violet's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her body was large, soft, always the butt of jokes and sharp comments, but she had never felt as heavy as she did now, like her own weight was dragging her down into the snow. "Mama," she sobbed, "please, I'll say yes. I'll marry whoever you want. Don't make this harder," Lydia choked, finally glancing at her with eyes full of shame and something like terror. Just pray, Violet." Silas jerked the reins, turning the horse away. "There's a ravine a quarter-mile back. Grizzlies come through here a few times a week. By morning, there won't be anything left to bury." He spurred the horse onward. The sound of hooves faded into the forest, swallowed by the sighing of the pines and the distant rush of wind. Violet was alone. The cold sank into her bones with ruthless speed. Her fingers burned, then numbed. She tried to stand, but one ankle slipped on the ice, twisting sharply. Pain screamed up her leg. She bit down on a cry, hand flying to the rough bark of a nearby tree to steady herself. Somewhere in the distance, a low, rumbling growl rose and fell, carried by the wind. Violet's breath hitched. She knew that sound. Everyone in town did. Stories whispered over saloon tables and in church pews about grizzlies that could crush a man's skull with one swipe, about hunters who never came back. She limped forward anyway, snow grabbing at her skirt, branches ripping at her sleeves. The darkness between the trees seemed to move, thick and alive. "Please," she whispered into the night, voice cracking, "if anyone can hear me, if anyone's out there, don't let me die like this." A branch snapped somewhere behind her, loud and close. Another growl. Closer. Violet turned, back hitting a rock face she hadn't seen in the dark. She was cornered. Every breath filled her lungs with air so cold it hurt. The growl became a roar, deep and earth-shaking, and then a gunshot tore the night in half, echoing off the stone. From the shadows beneath the pines, a tall, broad figure stepped into the silver wash of moonlight, rifle raised, eyes locked on the beast she couldn't yet see. If you're listening to this right now, tell me in the comments where in the world you are. Would anyone in your town survive a night like this? The gunshot cracked through the trees like lightning, followed by the savage bellow of something huge and furious. Violet flinched, hands flying to her ears. For a heartbeat, she saw nothing, only the blur of her own breath and the ghost white of snow. Then the grizzly stepped into view. It was bigger than any nightmare her mind had conjured, massive shoulders rolling with muscle, fur dark and matted, its head low and eyes lit with cold animal hunger. It swung its muzzle toward her, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of blood from her scraped knees, her twisted ankle, her fear. Violet pressed herself against the rock, fingers digging into the frozen stone. She couldn't outrun it. She could barely stand. The cold, hard truth slid into her chest. This is where I die. Another figure moved between her and the bear, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in worn leather and fur. The man stepped forward like he belonged to this wilderness, like he was carved from the very mountain beneath their feet. He held a rifle with the ease of long habit, the barrel steady despite the adrenaline crackling in the air. "Easy," he said in a low, calm voice that didn't fit the chaos. It was more to the bear than to her. "You don't want her. You want me." The grizzly rose up on its hind legs, towering over both of them, a living wall of fur and teeth and power. It roared, the sound rattling Violet's bones. The man didn't flinch. "Sir," Violet choked, voice thin and shaking, "please, run." "Can you move?" he asked, eyes never leaving the bear. "My ankle," she stammered. I don't think I can stand." His jaw tightened. "Then you're not the one who should be running." He fired again, not at the bear, but into the snow in front of it, the shot exploding upward in a spray of white. The grizzly snapped its head toward him, enraged, lowering itself back onto all fours. "That's it," he murmured, dropping the spent cartridge, working the lever with practiced speed. "Look at me, big fella." The bear lunged. He fired once more, this time aiming for its shoulder. The bullet hit. The beast roared and staggered, but it didn't stop. A wounded grizzly was more dangerous than ever. "Go!" he barked, voice finally breaking its calm as he sidestepped, drawing the bear away from Violet. "Crawl, drag yourself if you have to, get to those trees and stay low." Violet forced her frozen limbs to move. Every inch she dragged herself across the snow felt like someone driving nails into her ankle, but she obeyed. Her fingers clawed grooves into the icy ground as she pulled herself behind a fallen log, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear anything else, but she heard enough. The bear's roar as it struck, the man's grunt as something heavy hit him, the sickening thud of bodies colliding. Violet dared to look. The man had dropped the rifle, no time to reload. The grizzly's massive paw had caught his shoulder, tearing through leather and wool. He stumbled, but did not fall. In the same motion, he drew a long hunting knife from his belt, steel flashing in the moonlight. He met the charge head on. "Don't!" Violet whispered, tears streaming down her face, breath fogging the air. "Please, don't die because of me." The bear swiped again, claws slicing through empty air as the man turned just out of reach. The movement was practiced, disciplined. He'd fought for his life before. He stepped in close, driving the knife into the thick muscle of the bear's side, twisting, then wrenching it free before leaping back. Blood darkened the fur, but the grizzly only roared louder. It snapped at him, jaws closing around his leg long enough to make him stagger. He struck again, this time higher, near the neck, putting his whole weight behind the blow. The bear crashed into him, knocking him to the ground, the two of them rolling in a tangle of fur and leather, snow flying in all directions. Violet pressed her fist to her mouth, shaking. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, but she couldn't. This man, a stranger, had stepped between her and death without even knowing her name. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime compressed into a handful of brutal seconds, the bear shuddered and collapsed beside him, the great body sinking into the snow. Silence rushed in, deafening. The man lay still for a moment, chest heaving. Then he pushed himself onto one elbow, pain etched into the taut lines of his face. Violet crawled toward him, sobs breaking free. "Sir, sir, are you alive? Please, please, don't be dead." He turned his head toward her, eyes finding her in the dim light. They were not the eyes of a drunken brute or cruel tyrant. They were storm gray, sharp and assessing, framed by lines that spoke of too many winters and too many losses. "I've been better," he rasped, the corner of his mouth twitching in the faintest shadow of a smile. "But yes, I'm alive." Blood seeped through his torn coat at the shoulder and lower leg, staining the snow beneath him. His breath came shallow. "You're hurt," Violet said, panic rising. "You're badly hurt." "So are you?" His gaze dropped to her ankle, already swollen beneath the torn hem of her dress. "Can you stand?" She shook her head. "I tried. I can't. I'm too heavy. Stop." His voice cut through her apology like a clean blade, not cruel, not mocking, firm. "You're not a problem to be weighed. You're a person who needs to get out of the cold before we both freeze to death." Her throat tightened. No one had ever corrected her like that, especially not a man. He drew a slow, pained breath. "My cabin's not far, 1/2 mile, maybe less. I can get us there." "You can barely move," Violet protested. "You just fought a bear with a knife." "And I'd rather not waste the effort by dying 10 minutes later." He pushed himself upright, grimacing as his leg took weight. "Come on." He staggered to his feet and reached for her. His hands were rough, calloused, warm even through the chill. He didn't flinch when he pulled her up, didn't grunt or curse at her size, didn't roll his eyes like Silas always had. He simply braced himself and took her weight without comment. "Lean on me," he said. "I've carried elk twice your size down this mountain. I can handle you." Her breath caught, not at the words themselves, but at the matter-of-fact way he said them. No insult, no sneer, just confidence. "Who are you?" she whispered, awed and shaken. "Isaiah Blackwood," he answered, "and until we're behind my cabin door with a fire going, I'm the man who's not going to let you die out here." He tightened his arm around her, turned toward the dark line of trees, and began the slow, painful journey through the snow. Behind them, the grizzly lay still. Ahead of them, somewhere beyond the black pines and brutal cold, a faint orange glow waited, a promise of warmth, of safety, of something Violet had never truly had. A chance to live. The cabin came into view only when Violet thought she could no longer take another step. A faint plume of smoke curled from the stovepipe, nothing more than a ghost against the night sky. But it was enough. Isaiah held her tightly against his side, his limp worsening with every yard they crossed. When they finally reached the door, he nearly collapsed with her weight still in his arms. Violet scrambled to keep him upright, terrified that if he fell, she would never get him up again. He shoved the door open with his shoulder, and they stumbled into the small, dark cabin. The cold followed them inside like a living thing. The moment the door shut, Violet sagged with exhaustion. Her knees buckled, and Isaiah had to brace himself against the wall to keep both of them standing. His breath was ragged, and she could tell he was barely holding on. "Sit," she whispered, guiding him toward the bed. No. His voice was hoarse but firm. "Fire first." He leaned heavily on the table while Violet hurried to the hearth. Her hand shook as she stacked kindling and struck flint. Sparks caught, flames flared, and warmth began to seep into the room. When she turned back to Isaiah, he was leaning against the table, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. Blood had soaked through both his shoulder and his leg, dripping steadily onto the floorboards. "Isaiah," her voice trembled, "you're losing too much blood." He nodded once. No bravado, no bluffing, just the quiet acknowledgement of a man who knew exactly how close death stood. "Violet," he said, staggering toward her, "listen carefully. What I'm about to ask will sound strange, maybe even frightening. But if we don't do it, we'll both freeze before sunrise." She swallowed hard. "I'll do anything. Tell me." He inhaled sharply, steadying himself before he spoke. "You need to strip everything, all your clothes, now." The words struck like an axe. Violet froze. The fire cracked loudly in the silence. A lifetime of mockery came rushing back. Every insult, every sneer, every voice calling her fat, ugly, unworthy. Her arms instinctively wrapped around her body. "Why?" she stammered. "Isaiah, I don't understand." He sank onto a wooden stool, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "Your clothes are soaked through," he said, pointing to her dress. "Sweat, melted snow, the fall down the ravine, all of it. Even a few hours in wet fabric, and the cold will kill you. Hypothermia doesn't care if you're young or strong. It comes fast, especially for someone who's been terrified and injured." Her breath hitched. She hadn't even realized how cold she was until he said it. Her fingers were numb. Her lips tingled. The fire, though burning bright, barely touched her. Isaiah continued, voice strained but steady. "And I need to see if you're hurt anywhere you can't feel yet. Shock hides damage. You took a fall hard enough to break bone, twist muscle, tear skin. If you're bleeding under those layers, we need to know. Tonight." Violet's cheeks burned with humiliation. She looked down at her body, her thick arms, her soft belly, her thighs she had always tried to hide. No one had ever seen her unclothed. Not even her mother had looked at her with anything except shame. "I can't." The whisper trembled out of her before she could stop it. I'm not something people want to look at." Isaiah lifted his gaze to hers. Not a flicker of disgust, not a hint of mockery, only urgency. "Violet," he said quietly, "I just fought a 300-pound grizzly with nothing but a knife. If I wanted to hurt you, I could have left you there." His voice softened. "This isn't about your body. This is about survival. You are freezing, and I'm bleeding out. We don't have the luxury of modesty tonight." Her throat tightened painfully. But Isaiah wasn't finished. "And for what it's worth," he added, almost under his breath, "nothing about you is something to be ashamed of." She stared at him, stunned. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Honest, steady, without pity or cruelty. Something inside her cracked open, something fragile and long buried. "Turn around," she whispered, "please, while I do it." Isaiah nodded immediately. He pivoted toward the wall, gripping the back of the chair with white knuckles as pain rocked him. He didn't peek, didn't shift, didn't so much as breathe wrong. Hands trembling violently, Violet peeled away her frozen dress. The fabric stuck to her skin, tearing at scraped flesh. Her petticoat followed, then the chemise, everything damp and heavy and deadly cold. When she was bare, she let out a small broken sound, half sob, half trembling gasp. "Isaiah," she whispered, "I'm ready." He didn't turn until she told him he could. When he faced her, his eyes didn't widen or dart away. He looked at her the way one might look at a painting or a sunrise, quiet, considering, steady. She wrapped a blanket around herself, but for the first time, shame didn't choke her. Not entirely. "Good," he said softly. "Come here. Sit by the fire." She obeyed, lowering herself onto the fur-covered floor. Isaiah reached for her hands, turning them over gently, inspecting them, then her arms, then her shoulders. He checked her ribs for bruising, apologizing when she flinched. His touch was professional, careful, not lingering, not hungry, just human. When he reached her ankle, she hissed in pain. "Sprain," he murmured, "bad one, but not broken." She looked up. "Isaiah, you haven't let me see your wounds yet." He grimaced. "Because they're ugly." She gave him a faint, watery smile. "So am I. But you looked anyway." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise first, then something deeper, warmer. "All right," he said quietly. "Help me with the bindings, and get ready for a lot of blood." She crawled closer, pulling the blanket tighter around herself, and braced him as he removed his coat and shirt. When she saw the wounds, deep, jagged, and still oozing, her breath hitched. "You fought that thing for me," she whispered, voice cracking. "I'd do it again," he said simply. She cleaned and rebandaged his shoulder, then his leg, working with a care and gentleness that made Isaiah's eyes soften even through the pain. When they were both wrapped in blankets beside the fire, two injured souls surviving the night by inches, Violet felt something she had never known in her life. Safety, belonging, worth. And Isaiah, leaning back, eyes half closed, spoke one last time before sleep dragged him under. "This cabin's small. The heat won't hold unless we share it." A pause. No fear, no expectations, just warmth. Violet swallowed hard. "All right," she whispered, and for the first time since childhood, she fell asleep next to someone who didn't see her as a burden, a joke, or a sin, but as a life worth saving. Morning came softly in Isaiah Blackwood's cabin, a pale wash of gold slipping through the frost-rimmed window. The fire had burned low, leaving a bed of glowing embers that pulsed like a quiet heartbeat. Violet stirred beneath the heavy fur blanket, the heat of it sinking deep into her bones. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she felt the steady rise and fall of the man beside her, warm, alive, breathing, and the memories returned with the clarity of sunlight on snow. The bear, the blood, his hands guiding hers as she tied the bandages, his calm voice telling her she was worth saving. She opened her eyes fully. Isaiah lay on his back, face turned toward the ceiling, dark hair spilling over the furs. Even in sleep, he looked like a man who carried storms inside him, jaw tense, brows drawn, breath heavy with pain. He had one arm wrapped loosely around the blanket they shared, not touching her, careful, even in unconsciousness, to give her space. Violet sat up slowly, wincing when her swollen ankle brushed the floor. She adjusted the blanket to keep him warm, then reached for a nearby pot. The cabin was small, one bed, a table, shelves carved from rough timber, the wood stove in the corner, but it felt more like a home than any place she had ever known. She set water to heat, biting her lip as she limped across the room. The pain was sharp, but not unbearable. She could manage. When she turned back, Isaiah's eyes were open. "You shouldn't be walking on that yet," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "And you shouldn't be awake," she countered softly. "You need rest." He gave her a look, dry, faintly amused but edged with real worry. It was the first time anyone had ever looked at her like that, not irritated, not dismissive, concerned. "It's hard to rest," Isaiah said, trying to sit up until she hurried over and steadied him. "When someone is hobbling across the room like she's made of iron instead of flesh." "You fought a bear," she whispered. "You deserve breakfast." He blinked, startled by the matter-of-fact tenderness in her tone. "Most women I've met wouldn't call porridge and dried meat breakfast." "Most women haven't been abandoned in a snowstorm," she said quietly. For a long moment he simply watched her, studied her, as if trying to understand how someone could endure so much and still speak with gentleness. Then he exhaled. "All right, but let me help. You can barely stand, and you can barely walk." Their eyes met, and without meaning to, they both smiled, the first soft, unguarded smile they had shared. She allowed him to assist her back to the bed. He eased down beside her, careful not to jostle her ankle. "There's broth in the cabinet behind us," he said. "If we add water and heat it long enough, it'll soften up." Violet nodded, but remained seated, hands folded. She could feel him looking at her again, more intently this time. "Last night," Isaiah began quietly, "you were brave." Her breath caught. "I was terrified." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's what you do in spite of it." She stared at her hands, cheeks warming. No one had ever praised her before, not for anything that mattered. "You saved my life," he continued. "You kept me from bleeding out. You cleaned wounds most people wouldn't dare touch." "You saved mine first," she whispered. "We saved each other," he corrected. The words settled between them like a warm blanket. Violet swallowed, then forced herself to stand again. Isaiah reached out instinctively, but she shook her head with a small, determined smile. "I can manage. Besides, you're not the only one who knows how to be stubborn." He huffed a low laugh. "Fair enough." She stood over the stove until the broth warmed, stirring slowly, the scent of herbs and smoke filling the cabin. Every few seconds she glanced at Isaiah, half to check he was still breathing, half because something about him drew her gaze without her permission. He hadn't shaved in days. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw. His hair was unkempt, his shirt torn, his arm wrapped awkwardly, but there was strength in the way he held himself, even injured, a grounded, unshakable presence. She brought him a wooden bowl first. "You eat," she said. "You need strength more than I do." "Violet, please." He hesitated only a moment before taking it. His fingers brushed hers, warm, rough, calloused from years of work. She felt the touch all the way to her chest. Isaiah lifted a spoonful to his lips, then paused. "You first?" he said suddenly. Her brow furrowed. "Why?" He held out the spoon. "Because I want to know you're eating, too." The gesture nearly undid her. She leaned forward, took a small sip, and tried to pretend her throat wasn't tightening. "Good," he murmured. "Now sit. Rest while I finish." She obeyed without argument. It felt strange, being cared for, being seen. After a few minutes, Isaiah set the bowl aside, bracing himself on the table as he slowly stood. Violet's eyes widened. "You shouldn't—" He lifted a hand, silencing her. Humor me. He began gathering wood from the stack by the door, moving stiffly but steadily. Violet watched him, heart twisting. Every wince was like a blow to her own chest. Isaiah, she whispered, you're hurt. So are you. He placed the wood by the stove. But as long as we're breathing, we work. That's how mountain folk survive. She swallowed. I'm not mountain folk. You're here, Isaiah said simply. You're alive. That's enough. The words stunned her with their simplicity. Later, when they sat side by side mending torn clothes, her stitches crooked but earnest, his movements slower than usual, Isaiah began telling her about the land, about the deer trails that cut across the ridges, the places where the creek froze solid, the caves where wolves sheltered during blizzards. His voice was a low, steady rumble like distant thunder. Violet listened as if every word was a spark catching inside her chest. Do you live alone? She asked softly. Yes. For how long? 7 years. She looked down. That must be lonely. A silence followed, longer than before. It was, Isaiah admitted, until now. Her breath stopped. He leaned back against the log wall, exhaling slowly. I didn't expect company, and I sure as hell didn't expect someone who'd carry me half across the valley. I didn't carry you, she whispered. You kept me on my feet, he said. That's worth more. Her eyes burned suddenly. She blinked quickly. You deserve kindness, Violet, Isaiah said quietly. Not because you saved me, not because you're useful, because you're a human being, and because somewhere along the way, people forgot to tell you that. She made a soft, cracked sound. Come here, he said, shifting slightly to make space beside him on the bed. She hesitated, but only for a moment. She climbed beside him, leaning carefully against his uninjured side. His arm came around her, not possessively, not boldly, just gently, as if asking whether the world had ever held her softly before. It never had. But now she felt something new bloom inside her chest. Warmth, safety, a spark of something she had no name for, maybe hope. Outside, the winter wind howled against the cabin walls. Inside, 2 broken souls sat close enough to feel each other's heartbeat. And for the first time in years, neither felt truly alone. Snow fell harder in the days that followed, burying the cabin beneath a white, muffled world. Violet settled into a gentle rhythm, tending the fire, preparing meals, helping Isaiah change his bandages, and learning the small wilderness tasks he trusted her with. Isaiah grew stronger each day, though he still walked with a limp, each step marked with quiet grit. The peace between them deepened, soft, careful, and unexpectedly comforting. But peace in the mountains never lasted long. On the 10th morning, Isaiah stood by the window, staring out at the thick pines. His jaw was tight, the muscle in his cheek shifting as he clenched it unconsciously. Violet noticed immediately. Is it your leg? She asked, stepping closer. No. His tone was even, but his eyes stayed fixed on the tree line. Tracks in the snow, multiple horses, too many to be hunters. Her stomach tightened. Are they coming here? Not yet, but they're headed this direction. Violet wrapped her arms around herself, bracing against a cold that had nothing to do with winter. Who would come all this way? Isaiah turned toward her, studying her face. I could ask you the same thing. She froze. Until now, he hadn't pushed her past what she chose to share, but the moment she had dreaded since the night of the bear finally arrived. Violet, Isaiah said gently, people don't abandon someone in the middle of a grizzly's hunting grounds unless they intend for her to die. Someone wanted you gone, someone dangerous. Her breath caught. Isaiah. He didn't move closer, didn't crowd her. He simply waited, steady as the mountains behind him. That patience unraveled her faster than anger ever could. My stepfather, she whispered, voice trembling. Silas Hartley. He wanted to force me to marry an old rancher who was willing to pay him. When I refused, he said I wasn't worth the food I ate. He said I was a burden and a waste. Isaiah's expression hardened like ice forming over a river. He was the one who left you to die. She nodded. Did your mother know? A tear slid down Violet's cheek before she could stop it. She didn't stop him. Isaiah swore under his breath, low, furious, nothing like the calm she was used to. He stepped toward her, then paused, searching her eyes. Violet, he said carefully, there's something you need to know. Those tracks out there, they're fresh. Whoever's riding isn't lost. They're looking for something or someone. The words hollowed her out from the inside. Silas. She had known deep down this moment might come. A man like him didn't leave loose ends. If he realized she had survived, he would see her existence as a threat. What do we do? Violet whispered. Isaiah didn't hesitate. We survive, together. She swallowed hard. You would risk yourself again? He stepped closer, placing a hand over hers. His touch was warm, steady. I didn't haul myself out of a grave of bear claws just to let some coward on horseback finish the job. Her throat tightened. I don't want you hurt because of me. You're not a burden, Violet. Isaiah's voice softened. You're a person someone tried to throw away. That doesn't mean you deserve to be hunted. Her breath shook. And, he added, eyes locking with hers, I won't let anyone take you from here. This cabin is your home as much as mine. She lowered her head, unable to speak around the emotions swelling in her chest. But the world outside gave them no time for softness. A sharp knock thundered through the cabin, loud enough to shake the walls. Violet flinched. Isaiah's eyes went cold. Get behind me, now! She obeyed without question, stepping back as Isaiah retrieved his rifle and limped toward the door. He didn't open it, just shouted through the wood. State your business. A man's voice called back, loud and oily with confidence. We're looking for a runaway girl. Big one, slow, probably froze to death by now, but the snow shows tracks headed up this way. Violet's blood turned to ice. Isaiah didn't hide the steel in his tone. No one here fits your description. Funny, the man replied, because I heard you brought someone in. Saw drag marks too, big drag marks. Violet pressed a hand over her mouth, heart pounding so hard she felt lightheaded. Isaiah leaned closer to the door, voice dropping to a lethal calm. Leave, now, before the weather takes your horses, or I do. A beat of silence followed. Then the stranger chuckled. We'll be back, with more men, and if you're hiding her. His voice dipped into a sneer. We'll take it out of your hide, mountain man. Hooves pounded away through the snow. Isaiah waited until the sound had fully faded before lowering his rifle. He turned to Violet, and the fury in his face drained instantly, replaced by something rawer, deeper. He crossed the room, placing both hands on her shoulders. Listen to me, he said quietly. I won't let them touch you. Her breath shook as she tried to steady herself. Isaiah, he'll kill you. No, Isaiah said, shaking his head. Men like him prey on the weak. He's not prepared for someone who fights back. But you're still healing. You're not at full strength, and you think I'd let them haul you away while I sit here and count stitches?" She shook her head fiercely. "I don't want you dying for me." Isaiah's gaze softened in a way that stole her breath. "I'm not dying for you, Violet." His thumb brushed lightly over her arm. "I'm living because of you." Her lips parted in surprise. He continued, voice low. "Before you came into my life, I wasn't living. I was existing, waiting for time to finish what grief started." His eyes searched hers. "But you pulled me out of that. You made me want something again." Her heart thudded painfully. "I won't lose that," Isaiah whispered. "I won't lose you." Violet leaned into him then, unable to stop herself. His arms wrapped around her with instinctive certainty. She felt his heartbeat beneath her cheek, slow, steady, grounding her in a world that suddenly felt like it was tilting. When she finally pulled back, she took a shaky breath. "What do we do now?" Isaiah looked toward the window, where snow swirled against the glass like restless ghosts. "We prepare," he said, "because when they return, they won't be looking for a conversation." He turned back to her, his voice steady as the mountains outside. "And this time, Violet, you won't face them alone." The storm arrived before the men did. By nightfall, the wind slammed against the cabin with the force of a living thing, rattling shutters and howling through the pines. Violet fed more logs into the stove, while Isaiah moved slowly but deliberately around the small room, checking weapons, tightening straps, sharpening his hunting knife. Every movement cost him pain. She could see it in the stiff set of his shoulders, but he never once faltered. "Isaiah," she whispered, "you shouldn't be standing." "And you shouldn't be hunted," he replied calmly. "Yet here we are." The storm masked the sounds of the approaching horses until they were nearly upon them. Violet's pulse hammered. "They're here." Isaiah extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into glow-lit shadows from the stove. "Stay behind me. Whatever happens, do not open that door." A fist slammed into the wood. "Open up, Blackwood," a voice roared. "We know she's in there." Isaiah stepped forward, body tense but steady. "Violet," he murmured, "breathe." Another blow shook the hinges, then another. "Come out, girl! Your daddy wants a word." Violet flinched. The memories lashed across her mind. Silas shoving her, calling her worthless, dragging her by the arm to men twice her age, leaving her in the forest like garbage. Isaiah put a hand on her arm. "You're not going back to him." Her breath steadied just a fraction. Silas's voice cut through the storm. "Blackwood, you hand her over, and maybe we let you live." "Maybe." Isaiah glared at the door. "You take one more step toward that threshold," he said, voice cold enough to freeze the river outside, "and you'll wish the bear had gotten to you first." A rough laugh sounded. "Try me." Without warning, the door burst inward. 3 men stormed in, snow spraying across the floor. Silas stood behind them, face twisted with triumph and hate. Isaiah moved first. He swung the butt of his rifle into the nearest man's jaw. The man collapsed instantly. The second lunged, knife drawn. Isaiah blocked the slash with his forearm, grunting as the blade grazed him, then drove his elbow into the man's throat. Violet screamed as a third man rushed toward Isaiah's blind side. Without thinking, she grabbed the first weapon she could, a heavy iron pot from the stove, and swung it with all her strength. It crashed into the attacker's head with a sickening thud. He dropped. Isaiah turned in shock. "Violet!" But she had no time to answer. Silas shoved past the fallen men and strode into the cabin, eyes locked on her, face red with fury. "You stupid, ungrateful cow," he snarled. "I should have drowned you when you were born." Violet froze, not in fear, but in something deeper, older. A lifetime of humiliation throbbed inside her chest, threatening to swallow her whole. Isaiah stepped forward. "Touch her," he growled, "and I will bury you under your own damn horse." Silas laughed, pulling a revolver from his coat. "She's mine, bought and paid for?" The world narrowed for Violet, shrinking to the gun, to Silas's snarl, to the memory of Isaiah collapsing in the snow after fighting the grizzly. Something in her snapped. "No," she said. Silas blinked. "What?" Violet stepped forward, heart slamming but voice steady. "I'm not your property, not your burden, not your mistake. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Isaiah reached for her, protective, but she raised a hand. She wasn't finished. "You left me to die," she said, voice breaking but strong. "But I lived. I lived because someone thought I deserved to." Silas snarled, "Shut your mouth!" Isaiah moved at the same instant Silas raised the gun. The shot rang out like thunder. Violet gasped. Silas staggered backward, staring at the arrow protruding from his shoulder, an arrow with black fletching. Isaiah turned sharply. Framed in the doorway stood two hunters, neighbors from miles down the ridge, bows raised, faces grim. "Blackwood," the taller called. "Saw tracks headed this way. Figured you might need a hand." Silas's men groaned on the floor. Silas himself clutched his bleeding shoulder, pale with shock. Isaiah limped toward him, voice low and deadly. "You will never come near her again." Silas spat weakly. "She's worthless." Isaiah's jaw flexed. He didn't answer. He simply hauled Silas out the door and threw him into the snow. The hunters followed, securing ropes, forcing the wounded men onto their horses. "We'll take them to the sheriff," one said. "Attempted murder's no small charge." Isaiah nodded. "Make sure they don't come back." When the last rider disappeared into the storm, the cabin fell silent again, warm, flickering, safe. Isaiah turned to Violet. She stood trembling, not from fear, but from the enormity of what had happened, from the fact that she had fought, spoken, chosen herself. Isaiah stepped closer. "You were brave," he whispered. Violet looked up at him, tears shining. "I didn't feel brave." "You were," he said softly. "Bravery is telling the nightmare it doesn't own you anymore." Violet swallowed hard, voice shaking. "Isaiah, are we safe now?" He cupped her face gently, his touch warm and grounding. "You're safe," he said. "As long as I breathe, you're safe." But outside, the storm still raged, and what came next would test the fragile hope they had just begun to build. The storm eased by dawn, leaving the world outside glittering beneath a pale veil of frost. The cabin, though still bearing the scars of the night's violence, felt impossibly warm, alive with the low crackle of the fire and the lingering hum of two hearts still racing from fear and relief. Violet sat at the small wooden table, fingers curled around a tin mug of steaming broth. Her hands trembled, but not from cold. She kept replaying the moment she stepped between Isaiah and Silas, the moment she spoke aloud words she'd buried her entire life. She'd never imagined she could face her tormentor and still stand afterward. Isaiah limped over, lowering himself carefully into the chair across from her. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his gaze, steady, searching, held more warmth than the fire behind him. "You didn't sleep?" he said softly. Neither did you. He gave a faint smile. I had good reason. Someone had to keep watch. She'd swallowed. Someone nearly died last night because of me. No, he said firmly. Someone lived because of you. She blinked, startled. Isaiah, you fought, he said, leaning forward. You protected me. You protected yourself. Violet, you stood taller last night than any mountain on this ridge. Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever seen strength in her, not in her body, not in her voice, not in her existence. Isaiah exhaled, his expression softening further. You're safe here, he said quietly, as if offering her something sacred. This place, this cabin, it's yours as much as mine, if you want it to be. Violet felt warmth bloom in her chest. Hope, tentative, trembling, but real. I've never had a home before, she whispered. You have one now, Isaiah murmured. You have me. Silence settled, gentle, full, healing. Snowflakes drifted past the window like feathers. Violet reached across the table, her fingers hovering uncertainly, until Isaiah took her hand in his. His touch was warm, steady, reverent. She felt her pulse thrum in her wrist, felt his thumb brush softly over her knuckles. Isaiah? She whispered. Yes. Do you think a person who's been thrown away can ever really be enough? He rose from his chair, walked around the table, and knelt beside her, not because he was weak, but because he wanted her to see him without walls, without distance. He looked up at her as if she were a miracle. Violet Hartley, he said softly, you are more than enough. You're the strongest person I know. And this place, this life I'm trying to build, means nothing if you're not here in it. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Isaiah reached up, brushing them away with his thumb. She leaned into his touch, letting herself breathe fully for the first time in years. Then he rested his forehead gently against her arm and whispered the words that would root themselves forever in her heart. You're home. A tremor went through her, not fear, not doubt, but the quiet breaking open of a soul that had been starved of tenderness for far too long. She slid her hand along his jaw, lifting his face toward hers. Their eyes met, uncertain, hopeful, aching. Then, I'll stay, she whispered. Isaiah rose, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. Good, he murmured, because the world outside may not be done testing us. But whatever comes, we face it together. Violet nodded, her voice barely a breath. Together. And in the soft morning light, with the fire warming the walls and the storm finally passing, they held each other, two broken hearts finding at last the place where they belonged. Stories born in the mountains have a way of reaching the quietest corners of the heart. Violet and Isaiah's journey reminds us that even the ones the world tries to throw away can find a home, a hand to hold, and a reason to keep breathing. And maybe you, listening right now, needed that reminder too. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, hope, strength, warmth, tell me. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Every comment, every voice, every place on the map makes these stories travel farther than any mountain wind ever could. Where are you listening from?